The entire story of medieval torture, how pain became proof of truth. In the medieval world, truth was not something calmly debated or carefully investigated. It was something believed to be revealed, often through suffering. Pain, in the eyes of medieval authorities, was not merely punishment. It was a tool, a language, and above all, a test. If the body endured, the soul was judged innocent. If it broke, guilt was assumed to have been hiding there all along. This belief did not come from cruelty alone. It came from fear, faith, and a fragile justice system struggling to impose order on a violent and uncertain world. Medieval Europe lacked many things we take for granted today: forensic science, standardized laws, trained investigators, and reliable prisons. Crimes were hard to prove. Witnesses lied. Confessions were rare. And so, a dangerous idea took root, that God would not allow the innocent to suffer unjustly. Pain, therefore, could be trusted to expose the truth, torture as divine logic. To medieval minds, God was actively involved in daily life. Storms, illness, famine, and victory in battle were all signs of divine will. Justice worked the same way. If someone was truly innocent, God would intervene. He would strengthen their body, still their screams, or spare them from death. This thinking led to the widespread use of ordeals, ritualized tests of suffering meant to invite God's judgment. A person accused of theft or heresy might be forced to carry a red-hot iron across a room. Another might be bound and thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty, rejected by the pure element. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. It was a system where survival mattered less than symbolism, from ordeal to interrogation. By the late Middle Ages, ordeals began to decline, especially as the Church slowly distanced itself from them. But torture did not disappear. Instead, it changed form. Pain moved indoors. Courts began using torture not as a public ritual, but as a method of interrogation. The goal was no longer divine spectacle, it was confession. A confession, once extracted, was considered the strongest possible proof. A person who admitted guilt, even under unbearable pain, was believed to be telling the truth, because why else would they confess? This logic ignored one obvious fact. People will say anything to make pain stop. Yet medieval law often treated confession as final and absolute. Once spoken, it could not be taken back. The instruments of suffering. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval torture was usually simple rather than theatrical. The most common tools required little craftsmanship, only time, patience, and strength. Victims were stretched on racks until joints dislocated. They were suspended by their wrists behind their backs, slowly tearing shoulders from sockets. They were crushed with weights, beaten rhythmically, or deprived of sleep for days until the mind fractured. Pain was carefully measured. Torture was not supposed to kill, at least not officially. Death meant the truth had not been properly revealed, but in practice many did die, bodies failed, infections set in. Internal bleeding went unseen. Their deaths were often recorded as unfortunate but necessary losses in the pursuit of justice. Who was tortured? Torture was not applied equally. The poor, the powerless, and the socially isolated were far more likely to suffer. Nobles could often avoid torture through status or payment. Women, especially those accused of witchcraft, faced particular brutality. Foreigners, religious minorities, and political enemies were prime targets. Heresy was one of the most dangerous accusations of all. To question doctrine was not just to challenge the church, it was to threaten the order of the universe. Torture, in these cases, was framed as a form of spiritual correction. Pain was meant to save the soul by forcing repentance. In reality, it destroyed bodies and silenced dissent. When pain replaced evidence. As torture became institutionalized, evidence mattered less. Suspicion alone could justify interrogation. Anonymous accusations were enough. Once torture began, the process fed itself. Confessions named accomplices. Accomplices were tortured and named others. Entire communities could unravel in waves of pain-driven testimony. The system created its own truth, one shaped by agony rather than facts. Ironically, medieval authorities were aware of torture's unreliability. Legal manuals warned that confessions extracted under pain might be false. Some courts required confessions to be repeated without torture to be valid. But once the damage was done, few recanted. Fear lingered, bodies remembered, the slow decline. By the late medieval and early modern periods, skepticism began to grow. Legal scholars questioned whether pain could truly reveal truth. Enlightenment thinkers later condemned torture as barbaric and irrational. Gradually, laws changed. Torture was restricted, then abolished in many regions. But its legacy remained. The idea that suffering proves guilt did not vanish overnight. It echoed in public punishments, in brutal prisons, and in the assumption that harsh treatment produces honesty. A dark lesson. Medieval torture was not an accident of ignorance. It was a system built on belief, a belief that pain could speak when people could not be trusted. It teaches a grim lesson. When fear outweighs compassion, and certainty is valued more than truth, suffering becomes acceptable, even sacred. In the medieval world, pain became proof, and in doing so, justice lost its humanity. The screams faded, the scars healed or killed, but the warning remains. Truth forced through suffering is rarely truth at all. Close your eyes now. Let the heavy curtains of the present fall away. We are drifting back, past the electric hum of the modern world, past the rattle of industry, into a deeper, quieter darkness. Imagine you are standing in a high-ceilinged stone chamber. The air here is cool and smells faintly of damp limestone and old beeswax. The only light comes from a few flickering tallow candles, their flames dancing in the draught, casting long, trembling shadows against the rough-hewn walls. Listen, can you hear the scratching of a quill on parchment? It is a dry, rhythmic sound, the sound of bureaucracy at work. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. We begin not in a dungeon, but in a library of law, for the story of torture is not written in blood initially, but in ink. To understand how the medieval world justified pain, we must look backward to the ghosts of Rome. The medieval legal system was built on the ruins of the Roman Empire, and among those ruins lay a specific legal concept known as quaestio, the questioning. In the golden age of Rome, torture was not a universal tool, it was a marker of status. A free citizen of Rome could walk the streets knowing their body was sacred, untouchable by the whip or the rack. Pain was reserved for the enslaved. A slave was not seen as a person with honour, but as a vessel that might hold the truth, a vessel that had to be cracked open to check the contents. It was a brutal logic. A slave had no reason to tell the truth for honour's sake, so truth had to be squeezed out of them like juice from a grape. But as the empire aged and fear grew, the walls of protection began to crumble. Emperors, paranoid of assassination, expanded the use of torture to include anyone accused of crime in laesae majestatis, crimes against the majesty of the state. Treason levelled the playing field. When the safety of the empire was at stake, everyone became a slave in the eyes of the law. This is the seed that lay dormant in the soil of Europe for centuries. When Rome fell, a strange thing happened. The so-called Dark Ages often depicted as a time of unbridled savagery, were actually, in some legal respects, surprisingly gentle regarding torture. The Germanic tribes that rose to power, the Franks, the Goths, the Saxons, had a different idea of justice. They viewed crimes as personal disputes, not sins against the state. If you injured a man, you didn't necessarily go to a dungeon, you opened your wallet. They operated on a system called weregild, or man price. Every part of the body had a specific monetary value. A thumb might be worth 20 shillings, a front tooth perhaps 6. It was a practical, if slightly morbid, insurance policy. Justice was a transaction, like buying a cow, though presumably with more arguing about the quality of the merchandise. For centuries, the silence of the dungeon was relatively unbroken. Trials were public, loud shouting matches settled by oath-swearing. If enough reputable people swore you were innocent, you were innocent. It was a contest of popularity and reputation, not an excavation of the soul. But as the centuries turned and the calendar crept toward the year 1000, society became more complex. Cities grew. Strangers lived side by side. You could no longer trust a man's neighbour to know his character. The old ways of oath-taking began to feel insufficient. How could you trust the word of a stranger? And here, the Church and the reviving study of Roman law began to intertwine. Scholars in dusty universities in Bologna began to rediscover the old Roman texts, the Digesta, which spoke of the absolute power of the state and the utility of pain. They read these ancient words with reverence. They saw a system that promised certainty. Simultaneously, the Church was grappling with a spiritual crisis. They believed that truth was one, absolute, divine, and hidden. The body was merely a husk, a temporary shell housing the eternal soul. If a crime had been committed, the truth of it was lodged inside that shell. Therefore, breaking the shell to retrieve the truth wasn't seen as an act of sadism. It was almost a form of surgery. Historians still argue whether this shift was a top-down imposition by power-hungry elites or a desperate bottom-up reaction to a rising crime rate that the old man-price system couldn't handle. But the result was clear. The revival of Roman law brought the quaestio back from the dead. The concept of the Queen of Proofs, and confessio, was born. They believed that no one would condemn themselves to death unless it was true. It seemed so logical to them. Why would a man say, "I did it," if he didn't? They failed to account for the sheer overriding desire to make the hurting stop, a psychological blind spot that would cost thousands of lives. And so, the philosophical trap was set. Truth became a physical object to be extracted. The courtroom began to darken, moving from the sunny, open fields of tribal assembly into the thick-walled secrecy of the interrogation chamber. The logic of pain had been established. Now, they just needed the methods to apply it. But before the rack and the screw became commonplace, the medieval world turned to a different kind of test, one that required no interrogator, only the terrifying silence of the elements. They turned to the ordeal. Trial by ordeal? Walking through fire? Imagine the warmth of a fire, not as a comfort against the winter chill, but as the glowing, unblinking eye of a judge. We find ourselves now in the high medieval era, roughly between the 9th and 12th centuries. The legal libraries of Rome are collecting dust, and in their place, the church nave has become the courtroom. The air here is thick with the scent of frankincense and the metallic tang of charcoal. The stone floor is cold beneath your feet, contrasting with the heat radiating from a brazier set before the altar. This is the setting for the Judicium Dei, the judgment of God. To the modern mind, the scene I am about to describe sounds like madness, but to the medieval mind, it was the ultimate rationality. If the world is God's creation, then the physical laws of that world, heat, weight, gravity, are subject to his will. A judge might be bribed, a witness might be mistaken, but fire does not lie. Fire burns only the wicked. This was the terrifying promise of the ordeal of hot iron. It was typically reserved for free men and women of some standing, those whose word was worth testing against the elements. The process was not a sudden burst of violence. It was a slow, agonizingly solemn ritual that stretched over days, designed to build a psychological pressure so immense that a guilty person would often crumble before the iron was even heated. The accused was required to fast for 3 days, living on bread, water, and prayer. They were separated from their community, stripped of their daily distractions, forced to sit in the silence of their own conscience. Imagine that solitude. 3 days to think about the lie you might be telling. 3 days to wonder if God really would perform a miracle for you. It brings a whole new meaning to sweating out a verdict. On the final day, the accused would enter the church. The congregation would be there, watching a sea of eyes in the candlelight. The priest, acting not as an interrogator, but as a divine referee, would celebrate Mass. He would admonish the accused, saying, "I adjure thee, by the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that you do not descend to the altar if you are guilty." It was a final chance to back out, to confess and accept a lesser earthly punishment rather than risk the wrath of the divine. If the accused remained silent, the iron was brought forward. It was usually a bar of iron or sometimes a glove of iron weighing roughly 1 to 3 pounds. It was placed in the brazier until it glowed a dull, menacing red. The priest would sprinkle holy water over it, blessing the metal, asking God to cool it for the innocent and let it burn the guilty. The accused would then step forward. They did not have to hold it forever, just long enough to walk 9 feet. 3 short, measured steps. 1, 2, 3. They would drop the iron. But the trial was not over. The hand was immediately bandaged and sealed with wax by the priest. This seal was crucial. It ensured no one could tamper with the wound, applying salves or ointments. For 3 more days, the accused had to wait, with their hand wrapped, feeling the throb of the burn, unable to look. On the 3rd day, the seal was broken. The priest would examine the hand. If the wound was healing cleanly, clean and without corruption, the accused was innocent. God had intervened. If the wound was festering or infected, they were guilty. The infection was seen as the physical manifestation of the sin rotting the soul. It is easy to assume that everyone failed this test, that physics always won and everyone burned. But here lies a fascinating historical truth. High numbers of people actually passed the ordeal. Records from Hungarian registers in the 13th century suggest a pass rate of over 50% in some years. How is this possible? Historians still argue whether this was due to the biological resilience of calloused medieval hands or something more human: mercy. The priests controlled the fire. They controlled the iron. If a priest believed the accused was innocent, or if the community needed peace more than it needed a conviction, he might pull the iron out a few moments early, or let the accused handle it with damp hands, creating a protective layer of steam, the Leidenfrost effect, that insulated the skin for just those few crucial seconds. The ordeal was as much a social drama as a legal one. One of the most famous stories of this trial belongs to Queen Emma of Normandy, mother of Edward the Confessor. In 1043, she was accused of unchastity, a dangerous charge for a royal widow. To prove her innocence, she did not carry iron. She walked over it. 9 red-hot ploughshares were laid out on the floor of Winchester Cathedral. The legend says she was led across them barefoot, her eyes raised to heaven in such a state of spiritual ecstasy that she didn't even realize she had finished the walk. "When shall I reach the ploughshares?" she reportedly asked, after she had already stepped off the last one. Her feet were examined and found without a blister. It is a beautiful image. The queen floating over fire, protected by her truth. Whether it happened exactly that way or was embellished by loyal chroniclers, the story reinforced the belief that the innocent had nothing to fear. But there is a darker side to this reliance on miracles. It meant that justice was entirely external. You could not argue your case, you could only endure it. And while the ordeal of fire was terrifying, it was at least quick. The heat was sharp, the walk was short. There was another element, however, that the medieval courts turned to: a colder, deeper, and far more treacherous judge. As the smoke from the brazier fades, we turn our faces from the heat of the fire to the chill of the river. For those who were not noble, for the serfs and the outcasts, the fire was often deemed too dignified. They were sent to the water, and the water, unlike the fire, did not just want to burn them. It wanted to decide if they belonged to the earth at all. The cold judgment of sacred water. Step away from the warmth of the cathedral brazier now and follow the procession out into the grey, misty morning air. The ground beneath your feet changes from smooth stone to mud and tufts of damp grass. We are heading towards the river, or perhaps a deep, stagnant pond at the village edge. The mist clings to the water's surface, obscuring the far bank, making the world feel small and enclosed. The air here smells of wet earth, decaying reeds, and the sharp bite of impending winter. If fire was the judge of the nobility, water was the judge of the common man. It was the ordeal of cold water, a test as terrifying as it was economical. Fire required iron, fuel, and the precious time of skilled metalworkers. Water was free. It was everywhere. And in the eyes of the church, it was profoundly sacred. Consider the logic of the medieval mind again. Water was the element of baptism. It was the medium through which the soul was cleansed and welcomed into the community of God. Therefore, the theology went, water was a pure substance, it had a moral character. It would instinctively embrace the innocent, drawing them into its depths like a mother embracing a child. But the guilty were tainted by sin. Their souls were oily with wickedness. The pure water would be repulsed by them. It would refuse to accept them. It would spit them out. And so, we arrive at the grim paradox of this ordeal. To sink was to be saved. To float was to be damned. Imagine standing on the muddy bank, stripped of your outer garments, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sheer absurdity of the choice before you. You are about to be bound. The executioner, or the local bailiff, approaches with a rough hemp rope. They do not merely tie your hands, they bind you in a specific humiliating posture, often called the cross-binding. Your right thumb is tied to your left big toe, and your left thumb to your right big toe. You are trussed up into a compact, helpless ball, your body forced into a shape that defies all natural movement. This was not just to prevent swimming. It was to present the body as a passive object to the judgment of the element. You are no longer a person, you are a package to be weighed by the universe. A rope is tied around your waist, the other end held by men standing on the shore. This is the only mercy in the process, a lifeline to haul you back if the water decides to keep you. The priest steps forward to the water's edge. He does not bless you. He blesses the water. "I adjure thee, O water," he might chant, his voice cutting through the fog, "that thou do not receive this man if he be guilty of the charge brought against him. Reject him, make him float upon thy surface." It is a chilling invocation. He is commanding the physics of the lake to act as a jury. Then, with a splash that shatters the morning silence, you are tossed in. The shock of the cold is immediate and paralytic. It steals the breath from your lungs. And this physically is where the trial is truly decided. Think about the mechanics of buoyancy. If you panic, and who wouldn't, you might thrash, gasp, and fill your lungs with air. Air makes you buoyant. Air makes you float. In your terror, you might inadvertently condemn yourself, bobbing to the surface like a cork. Rejected by the water, the crowd on the bank would gasp, pointing fingers. See, the water refuses him. Guilt established by the laws of density. But if you are calm, perhaps through the peace of innocence, or perhaps just frozen by shock, you might exhale. You might let the air leave your body. And then you sink down into the murky green darkness, the sounds of the world muffled, the cold pressing in on all sides. You are innocent, you are vindicated, but you are also drowning. There is a dark absurdity here that creates a sliver of gallows humour. It was the only time in history where a person would pray fervently to sink like a stone. A bath was a rare enough event in the Middle Ages. A bath that judged your soul and tried to drown you was a luxury most would happily skip. The men on the bank watch the rope. If it goes slack, if the water swallows you, they wait a beat, just long enough to be sure, and then they haul. You are dragged back to the mud, coughing, retching water, half dead, but socially clean. You have been received by the sacred element. The accusation is washed away. Historians have long debated the statistical reality of this ordeal. Some argue that the sinkers were far more common, as the human body, especially when bound and exhaling, tends to be less buoyant than we think. This suggests that the ordeal of cold water was actually a way to acquit people, a release valve for social tension where the accused was likely to survive and be exonerated, provided the men on the rope were paying attention. However, other scholars point out that in times of hysteria, particularly later during the witch trials, the criteria changed. A floating woman wasn't just guilty, she was supernatural. The water didn't just reject her, she was defying gravity itself. There is a famous case from the 12th century involving a man named Aylward. Accused of breaking into a neighbour's house, he was subjected to the water ordeal. He sank. He was innocent. The water had spoken. But the local sheriff, a man who perhaps preferred his own judgment to God's, wasn't satisfied. He ignored the result and had Aylward mutilated anyway. This is a crucial crack in the facade. It shows us that even in the height of the age of faith, human skepticism and human cruelty lurked just beneath the surface. The miracle was only useful if it gave the authorities the answer they wanted. As the 12th century waned, the water ordeal began to lose its shimmering authority. It wasn't just sheriffs like Aylward's who were doubting, it was the intellectuals of the church itself. They began to look at these wet, shivering spectacles and ask a dangerous question. Are we tempting God? Was it right to force the Creator to perform a miracle on demand, just to settle a dispute over a stolen cow? The water, once the clear voice of judgment, was becoming murky with doubt. The spectacle of the riverbank, with its cheering crowds and gasping victims, began to look less like a divine court and more like a pagan superstition. The theologians in Paris and Bologna were writing furiously, arguing that justice required human investigation, not elemental magic, and so the currents of history shifted. The river was about to be replaced by something far drier, far more bureaucratic, and ultimately far more dangerous for the accused. The era of the elements was ending, the era of the Inquisitor was about to begin. But for that to happen, the world needed a singular moment, a turning point, where the old ways were officially outlawed. That moment came in a year that would rewrite the destiny of justice forever. The year everything changed. 1215. Time shifts forward now, moving away from the misty riverbanks and the smoking braziers of the village ordeal, travelling south across the Alps to the sun-baked, marble-strewn city of Rome. The year is 1215. For most history lovers, this date rings a bell because of a muddy field in England called Runnymede, where King John was busy being bullied by his barons into signing the Magna Carta. But while the English were arguing over taxes and fish weirs, a far more momentous event was unfolding in the Lateran Palace, one that would silently reshape the daily reality of human suffering for the next 5 centuries. This was the Fourth Lateran Council, a massive gathering summoned by Pope Innocent III. Imagine the scene: over 1,200 bishops, abbots, and priors, their heavy woolen robes rustling as they crowded into the stifling heat of the Roman Basilica. It was the Woodstock of the Middle Ages for the clergy, a place where the future of Christendom was debated not with guitars, but with canon law. Pope Innocent was a man of intellect, a lawyer pope who believed in order, hierarchy, and reason. He looked at the chaos of the trials by ordeal, the burning irons, the floating bodies, the erratic miracles, and he saw not divine justice, but a superstitious mess. He saw priests acting like sorcerers, commanding the elements in a way that bordered on magic. And so, with the stroke of a quill, he issued Canon 18. It was a short, seemingly bureaucratic rule: no cleric may pronounce a blessing or a consecration on a trial by hot or cold water or red-hot iron. It sounds like a minor administrative tweak, the medieval equivalent of an interdepartmental memo. But the implications were earth-shattering. You see, the ordeal required a priest. Without the holy water, without the blessing of the iron, the ritual was just a man burning another man. It lost its divine warranty. The system of God's judgment collapsed almost overnight. The ban created an immediate, terrifying vacuum. Suddenly, the judges of Europe were left alone in the room. God had left the building. For centuries, when a case was hard, when there were no witnesses, when it was just one man's word against another's, the judge could point to the fire and say, "Let God decide." It was a perfect way to avoid responsibility. Now, that crutch was kicked away. The judge had to decide. He, a fallible human being, had to look at the accused and determine the truth using his own mind. This terrified them. Whose were they to judge the soul of another? What if they were wrong? To fill this void, European courts turned frantically to the newly rediscovered Roman law, specifically a system of evidence that historians call the arithmetic of proof. This system was designed to be perfectly rational, a mathematical shield against error. It stated that to convict someone of a serious crime, you needed full proof, plena probatio, and full proof was strictly defined. You needed 2 reliable eyewitnesses who saw the crime happen with their own eyes. Not 1, but 2. If you had them, case closed. Guilty, justice was served. It sounds wonderfully fair, doesn't it? It sounds like the high standard of beyond a reasonable doubt that we cherish today. But there was a catastrophic flaw in this logic, one that any modern police officer could spot in a second. Most crimes do not happen in front of an audience. Murderers, thieves, and heretics rarely send out invitations or perform their deeds in the town square at high noon. They work in the dark. They work in secret. So, what happened when a judge had a suspect who was obviously guilty, someone who was found standing over the body, holding a bloody knife, but there was only one eyewitness? Under the strict rules of the arithmetic of proof, that was only half proof, semi-plena probatio. Mathematically, you cannot hang a man on 0.5 of a conviction. The judge would have to let him go. This was unacceptable. No society could function if obvious criminals walked free simply because they were smart enough to kill in private. The legal system faced a crisis of paralysis. They were trapped between their high standards of evidence and the gritty reality of crime. They needed a tiebreaker. They needed something that could turn half proof into full proof. And the Roman texts offered one other path to full proof, equal in weight to two eyewitnesses: confessio, the confession of the accused. If the criminal admitted it, that was the queen of proofs, Regina Probationem. It trumped everything. It solved the math problem. This is the tragic irony of legal history. The torture chamber was built not out of lawlessness, but out of a desire for too much certainty. Because the courts refused to convict on circumstantial evidence, because they refused to guess, they forced themselves to demand a confession. And how do you get a confession from a man who knows that admitting guilt means his death? You cannot ask him politely. You have to break him. Thus, the ban on ordeals, which was meant to make the law more rational and less barbaric, inadvertently opened the door to a system of institutionalized brutality that would dwarf the burns of the hot iron. The judge, once a referee of a divine game, transformed into an investigator. An inquisitor? His job was no longer just to listen. It was to hunt. He had to dig the truth out of the suspect's body, like a miner digging for gold. This transition didn't happen overnight. It was a slow creeping shadow that lengthened across the 13th century. At first, it was just isolation, then starvation, then the tools appeared. The legal scholars sitting in their ivory towers wrote long treatises justifying it. They called it tortura, a twisting. They argued that it was a necessary evil, a grim act of sanitation to keep the community safe. They created complex rules to regulate it, fooling themselves into thinking they could administer pain scientifically. They debated how much pain is enough. Can you torture a pregnant woman? Can you torture a child? The answer, chillingly, was often yes, but with a lidocaine. They built a bureaucracy of suffering, believing that if they wrote enough rules about it, it would somehow become civilized. Historians often debate whether the judges truly believed in the confessions they extracted. Did a magistrate in 1250 really think the man screaming on the rack was telling the truth? Or did he just need the paperwork to match the verdict? The consensus is a disturbing mix of both. Many likely knew the confessions were flawed, yet they also believed that God would grant the innocent the strength to remain silent. The old superstition of the ordeal hadn't really vanished. It had just moved indoors. Instead of God protecting you from the fire, he was now supposed to protect you from the pain. It was a darker, quieter, and far more lonely test. So, as the 13th century matures, we see a new figure emerging from the shadows of the courtroom. He is not a priest, he is not a warrior, he is a bureaucrat in a dark robe, holding a list of questions. He is the inquisitor, and he brings with him a new definition of truth. Truth is not what God reveals. Truth is what pain compels. The era of the safe trial was over. The era of the interrogation had begun. The silence of the dungeon was about to be filled with the sound of the scribe's pen scratching down every moan and every word, turning agony into a legal record. And to do this work, the judge needed help. He needed someone who didn't mind the blood, someone who lived on the edge of society, someone whose touch was taboo. He needed the executioner. But before we meet the man in the hood, we must understand the terrifying new legal machine he served, a machine that was about to turn its gaze on the most dangerous crime of all, the crime of wrong thinking, the rise of the Inquisitor. The dust of the road settles as a new figure enters the village, riding not on a war horse, but on a humble mule. He wears the simple white wool habit of the Dominican order, perhaps covered by a black cloak. The hounds of the Lord, as they are sometimes called. He carries no sword, no shield, only a book and a quill. Yet the silence that falls over the town square is heavier than the silence that greets a conquering army. Shutters are pulled closed. Conversations die in throats. This is the Inquisitor. To understand the terror he brings, we must understand the massive shift in the machinery of justice that he represents. Before this moment, medieval law was largely accusatorial. It was a private fight. If you believed your neighbour stole your pig, you had to accuse him publicly. If you couldn't prove it, you, the accuser, suffered the penalty intended for him. It was a high-stakes gamble that discouraged frivolous claims. But the Inquisitor changes the game. He operates under a new legal theory, inquisitio. He does not need an accuser. He acts on ill repute, rumour. He is the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury, all wrapped into one singular, terrifying intelligence. He is not here to settle a dispute. He is here to cure a sickness, and that sickness is heresy. We are now in the early 13th century, specifically in the sun-drenched, rebellious lands of southern France, known as Languedoc. This is the heartland of the Cathars, a religious movement that the Church views not just as different, but as a spiritual cancer. The Cathars believe that the physical world is the creation of Satan, a trap for the soul. To the Church, this is a contagious disease that threatens the eternal salvation of every man, woman, and child. If a plague breaks out, you do not debate the bacteria, you quarantine, you sanitize, you burn the infected clothes. The Inquisitor is the doctor sent to stop the outbreak. His goal, contrary to the bloody myths of Hollywood, is not to kill. Killing is a failure. If the heretic burns, his soul is lost. The Inquisitor's goal is reconciliatio, to bring the lost sheep back into the fold. But to save the sheep, he must first break its stubborn will. The process begins not with torture, but with psychology. The Inquisitor arrives and preaches the Sermo Generalis, a general sermon. He announces a period of grace, usually ranging from 15 to 30 days. He stands in the pulpit and offers a deal. Come to me now, confess your errors or the errors of your neighbours. If you speak now, during the time of grace, the penance will be light. A prayer, a pilgrimage, perhaps wearing a yellow cross on your tunic. But if you wait, if I have to come find you, there will be no mercy. It is a brilliant, devastating tactic. It turns the community against itself. The fear of being denounced by a neighbour drives people to rush to the Inquisitor's lodgings, desperate to confess first. Families fracture. Old grudges are settled with a whispered name. The Inquisitor sits in his makeshift office, writing it all down. He's building a massive database of secrets. These friars are meticulous record keepers. If you confessed to a minor heresy 20 years ago in a different village, they can find the record. You cannot hide from the ink. When the period of grace expires, the true hunt begins. The Inquisitor summons those who did not come forward. The suspect is brought into a room, rarely a dungeon at first, often just a chamber in a monastery or a bishop's palace. There is no lawyer. You are not told who accused you. You are not told the specific evidence against you, for fear you might retaliate against the witnesses. You are simply asked, do you know why you are here? It is a question designed to make the mind race, to force the suspect to spill secrets the Inquisitor didn't even know about. The manuals written by these men, like the famous Practica Inquisitionis by Bernard Gui, are chilling in their sophistication. They are not manuals of brutality, they are manuals of entrapment. They warn the Inquisitor that heretics are slippery, that they use equivocation. If you ask a Cathar, do you believe in the Virgin Mary? They will say yes, but in their minds they mean their own church, not the Catholic one. So the Inquisitor learns to ask the question 3 different ways, circling the truth, looking for the slip. But what happens when the logic fails? What happens when the suspect stares at the floor, denying everything, yet The inquisitor knows, based on the secret testimony of 3 neighbours, that this man attended a heretical meeting in the woods. The inquisitor faces a blockade. The suspect is lying. The devil is hardening his heart. It is here, in this frustration, that the authorization for physical pressure enters the canon. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issues the papal bull Ad Extirpanda. It is the fateful document that officially authorizes the use of torture by the Inquisition. But, and this is a crucial but, it comes with strict regulations. It must not cause the loss of a limb, membrum. It must not cause death, periculum mortis. It must only be used if there is already partial proof, and theoretically, it can only be used once. Of course, lawyers are experts at finding loopholes. The rule torture can only be applied once is easily circumvented. If the suspect confesses on the rack but recants the next day, the inquisitor does not repeat the torture. He simply continues the session that was interrupted. It is a semantic game played with human flesh. The inquisitor himself, being a man of God, is forbidden by canon law from shedding blood. He cannot be the one to turn the screw. He cannot be the one to wield the whip. To do so would make him irregular, unfit to celebrate Mass. So, he sits at a raised desk, the scribe beside him, the candle flickering between them. He asks the questions. A different man, a layman, stands in the shadows with the instruments. This separation is vital. It allows the inquisitor to maintain the persona of the grieving father. He can say to the victim, "I do not want this. You are doing this to yourself. Simply speak the truth, and I can make him stop. I can save you." He becomes the good cop in a scenario where the bad cop is a mute, masked nightmare. Historians still argue about the frequency of torture in these proceedings. The black legend of the Inquisition suggests a conveyor belt of agony, but the records, which are surprisingly complete, suggest that torture was actually used in a minority of cases, perhaps 10 to 20%, depending on the region and the decade. Why? Because the threat was usually enough. Was the sight of the instruments, the territio, terrifying the suspect, broke most people before a finger was laid on them. The inquisitor would lead the accused into the torture chamber and simply show them the rack, explaining in graphic clinical detail how it worked. The imagination is often a far more effective torturer than the mechanic, but when the words failed and the threat failed, the nod was given. The inquisitor would lean back, the scribe would dip his pen, and the layman in the corner would step forward. The spiritual duel was over. The physical audit was about to begin. The inquisitor watches with a detached, sorrowful gaze. He believes that the pain of the body is a small price to pay for the salvation of the soul. Better to have your joints dislocated now than to burn in the lake of fire for eternity. It is a twisted act of love. He is not enjoying this, or so he tells himself. He is a surgeon removing a gangrenous limb. And to perform this surgery, he relies on a man who exists on the absolute fringe of human society. A man who has no name in the records, only a title. A man who touches the untouchable. As the inquisitor closes his book and signals for the session to commence, we must shift our gaze to the hands that actually do the work. We must meet the executioner. The lonely life of the executioner. Step out of the interrogation chamber for a moment and walk to the edge of the town, past the bustling market, past the respectable houses, to a small isolated cottage, often situated near the tanneries or the refuse dump. The air here is pungent, heavy with the smell of curing leather and things discarded. This is the home of the Monsieur de Paris, the Scharfrichter, the executioner. If the inquisitor is the architect of pain, this man is the builder. But contrary to the hooded, mindless brood of horror movies, the historical executioner was often a complex, tragic, and highly skilled professional trapped in a life of profound loneliness. In the medieval social web, he was a necessary outcast. He was essential to the functioning of justice. Without him, the law was toothless. Yet his touch was considered physically and spiritually polluting. If an executioner walked into a tavern, silence fell. He often had his own marked cup, because no one would drink from a vessel his lips had touched. In some towns, he was required to wear a specific colour or ring a bell as he walked, warning good Christians to step aside. He was a man who lived in the shadow of the scaffold he built. To survive this isolation, the executioner was granted strange, grim privileges known as droit de havage, or the right of havoc. He could walk through the market and take a portion of grain, vegetables or meat from the stalls without paying, but because his touch was taboo, he couldn't reach into the baskets. He had to use a special spoon or ladle to scoop out his share, or the merchant would toss the goods to him to avoid contact. It is a heartbreaking image, a man fed by the community that refuses to look him in the eye. But his work required far more than just a strong arm. It required the knowledge of a surgeon. A common brute would kill the victim too quickly, ending the questioning before the truth was revealed. The executioner had to be a master of anatomy. He had to know exactly how far a joint could stretch before it snapped. He had to know how to inflict maximum agony without inducing the kind of shock that leads to unconsciousness. He was the dark mirror of the physician. In fact, in a twist of historical irony, executioners were often sought out for medical advice because they spent their lives dismantling bodies. They knew how to put them back together. They were experts at setting broken bones and treating skin diseases. People who wouldn't invite them to dinner would knock on their door at midnight, begging for a cure for a sick child. Let us look at the life of Franz Schmidt, a famous executioner from Nuremberg who worked in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. We know him because he did something extraordinary. He kept a diary. For 45 years, he recorded every execution and punishment he performed, over 3,000 of them. His writing is not the scrawl of a sadist. It is the sober, meticulous account of a civil servant. He did not choose this life. The job was hereditary, a tainted blood passed from father to son. Executioner families became dynasties, the Sansons in France, the Schmidts in Germany marrying only into other executioner families because no one else would have them. They were an incestuous guild of death. Schmidt's diary reveals a man who viewed himself as a professional tasked with restoring order. He took pride in a clean execution, a swift decapitation that spared the condemned unnecessary suffering. To him, a messy blow was a professional failure and a source of deep shame. He even spent his later years fighting a legal battle not for money, but to restore his family's honour so his children could become respectable citizens. He wanted to wash the blood off his name. But in the torture chamber, mercy was a different concept. Here, the executioner was an instrument of the state's curiosity. He had to calibrate the instruments with the precision of a watchmaker. He would attach the ropes, he would turn the wheel, he would apply the thumb screws. All the while he would listen to the inquisitor, stopping instantly at the raise of a hand. It was a macabre dance of three: the judge, the victim, and the mechanic. Historians still argue about the psychological toll this took on these men. Did they dissociate? Did they drink? The records suggest many did heavy penance. They gave generously to the church, perhaps trying to buy back the part of their soul they left in the dungeon. There is a touching tradition in some regions where the executioner, before the final blow, would ask the condemned for forgiveness. "I forgive you," the prisoner would say, "for you do your duty." It was a brief human moment, acknowledging that both of them were caught in a machine much larger than themselves. The tools this man used were not just random objects of cruelty. They were engineered devices, perfected over centuries to challenge the limits of human endurance. As we move deeper into the dark, we must examine these machines. We must look at the wood and the iron that defined the executioner's trade. We leave the man now, wiping his hands on a rag, and turn our eyes to the centre of the room, where a long wooden table sits, flanked by windlasses and ropes. It is the most iconic, the most feared, and the most ubiquitous tool of the trade. It is the rack, and it is waiting. The rack and the rope. Focus now on the centre of the chamber. The shadows peel back to reveal a device that has become the very symbol of medieval justice. Yet in its construction, it is terrifyingly mundane. It is the rack. To the untrained eye, it resembles a bed frame, a long rectangle of oak raised slightly off the damp floor. But there is no mattress, no pillow, only the hard, unforgiving grain of the wood. At either end, there are rollers, windlasses, fitted with thick hemp ropes. The mechanics of the rack are simple. It is a machine of tension. The accused is laid upon it, their wrists tied to one roller, their ankles to the other. The executioner inserts a wooden handle into the ratchet mechanism. Then he begins to turn. Click, the ropes go taut. Click, the body lifts slightly, hovering in the air. A suspension bridge of flesh and bone. Click, the stretching begins. The horror of the rack is not in the initial pain, but in the slow, inexorable accumulation of pressure. It is a war between the tensile strength of the ropes and the tensile strength of the human ligaments. The victim feels their joints opening, the ball of the humerus pulling away from the socket of the shoulder. It is the feeling of being unmade. The executioner knows the sound of the machine intimately. He knows the difference between the groan of the wood and the pop of a dislocating joint. In England, the most famous rack in the Tower of London was affectionately and darkly nicknamed the Duke of Exeter's daughter, after the constable who introduced it. It was said to be a jealous lover. Once it embraced you, it never wanted to let go. There is a grim irony here. The rack was often justified as a tool of preparatory questioning, a way to simply stretch the truth out of a man before the real torture began. But for many, the mere anticipation of that first click was enough to shatter their resolve. It turns out that humans are remarkably attached to having their limbs connected to their torsos. But the rack was heavy, expensive, and stationary. You couldn't easily take it on the road. For the mobile inquisitor, or the court on a budget, there was a far simpler, yet equally devastating method involving nothing more than a rope and a pulley. This was the strappado, also known as the cord. If the rack pulled you horizontally, the strappado pulled you vertically. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, an unnatural angle to begin with, and a rope was attached to the bindings. The rope ran up to a pulley in the ceiling. The executioner would simply hoist the victim into the air. Imagine the biomechanics of this. The entire weight of the body is suddenly suspended from the shoulders, rotated backward. The rotator cuffs scream, the chest muscles tear. The victim hangs there, toes dangling inches from the floor, a pendulum of misery. It is a torture of gravity. The executioner doesn't need to strike. He just needs to wait. The earth itself pulls down on the victim, doing the work for him. And if silence and gravity were not enough to produce a confession, there was the variation known as squassation. The executioner would hoist the victim to the ceiling and then, without warning, let go of the rope, only to jerk it tight just before the victim's feet touched the floor. The sudden stop acted like a whip crack on the body. The force would instantly dislocate the shoulders and often the hips as well. It was pure physics, weaponized against anatomy. Scholarly debate notes that while the rack is more famous in fiction, the strappado was likely the most common form of torture in Europe because it required zero infrastructure, just a sturdy beam and a length of rope. It was the everyman's interrogation tool. Yet, despite the horror of these devices, they were brutally honest in their function. You could see exactly how they worked. There were no hidden gears, no magical elements. They were wood, rope, and leverage. But as history drifted into the Victorian era, the memory of these simple tools wasn't enough for the storytellers. They needed something more gothic, more elaborate, more nightmarish. And so, they invented, or at least wildly exaggerated, a device that likely never saw a medieval dungeon. We must now separate the wood from the fantasy. We must open the iron doors of the most famous device that mostly never was. Myths of the Iron Maiden. Stand now in the corner of our imaginary dungeon where the shadows are deepest. Looming before us is a silhouette that has haunted the nightmares of children and the scripts of horror movies for nearly 2 centuries. It is the Iron Maiden. She stands tall, a sarcophagus of iron shaped, vaguely like a woman, often crowned with the stoic frozen face of the Virgin Mary. Her arms are rigid at her sides. Her cloak is a heavy door of metal. We imagine the scene. The accused is pushed inside. The heavy doors squeal on rusted hinges. And as they close, spikes positioned with diabolical precision pierce the eyes, the heart, and the lungs. It is the ultimate embrace of death, a claustrophobic, metallic hell where the victim is left to bleed in darkness, their screams muffled by the thick iron casing. It is the single most iconic image of medieval torture. And yet, I must whisper a secret that might disappoint the Gothic novelist in you. She never existed, at least not in the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden is a ghost, but not of a victim. She is a ghost of the Victorian imagination. To understand this deception, we must fast forward for a moment to the 19th century. This was an era obsessed with the macabre, a time when people toured morgues for entertainment and collected shrunken heads. It was also the era of the Gothic revival, when wealthy Europeans looked back at the Middle Ages with a mix of romanticism and superior horror. They wanted to believe that their ancestors were savage brutes because it made their own society of steam engines and pocket watches feel so much more civilized by comparison. They needed a symbol of that dark age, barbarism, something that screamed primitive cruelty. Enter Johann Philipp Siebenkäse, a German philosopher and archivist. In the late 1700s, he wrote a history of Nuremberg in which he claimed that a maiden had executed a coin forger in 1515. He described the spikes and the slow death. But there was no physical evidence, no rusted machine in a basement, no invoice from a blacksmith. It was just a story. But the story was too good to ignore. In the mid-19th century, entrepreneurial museums, sensing a cash cow, decided to build what Siebenkäse had described. The most famous one, the Nuremberg Virgin, was constructed likely around 1800 to 1860. It was a pastiche, a Frankenstein's monster cobbled together from spare parts. The body was likely an old barrel. The face might have been salvaged from a statue. The spikes were added for dramatic flair. When this device was displayed at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, crowds gasped in horror, convinced they were looking at a genuine relic of medieval evil. They weren't. They were looking at a tourist trap. Historians have combed through thousands of medieval court records, searching for a mention of the Eiserne Jungfrau. They have found plenty of ropes, plenty of racks, plenty of water, but no iron boxes with spikes. Think about the practicality for a moment. Medieval torture was, as we have seen, a system of interrogation. It required access to the victim. You needed to hear them confess. You needed to be able to stop the pain if they agreed to talk. The Iron Maiden seals the victim away. it silences them. It is a machine of execution, not interrogation, and even as an execution method, it is absurdly expensive. Why forge a massive, intricate iron box when a rope costs a few pennies and a sword lasts a lifetime? The Iron Maiden violates the first rule of medieval justice, efficiency. However, like all good lies, the myth was built on a grain of truth. While the deadly spiked coffin was a fantasy, medieval shame was very real. There was a device known as the shandmantle, or the coat of shame. It was a heavy wooden barrel or a weighted cloak that poachers, prostitutes, or drunkards were forced to wear in the public square. It was humiliating, it was heavy, and it smelled terrible, but it didn't have spikes. It was designed to crush your dignity, not your eyeballs. The Victorians simply took the boring reality of the weighted cloak and added the thrill of the spikes, transforming a tool of social shaming into a device of Gothic horror. There is a scholarly debate note here that is worth touching upon. Some historians argue that similar devices might have existed in isolation, perhaps as a singular sadistic invention of a deranged local lord, but there is no evidence of them being a standard tool of the judicial system. The famous Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was actually destroyed in the Allied bombing of 1944, taking its secrets to the grave, but tests done on it before the war suggested the spikes were added centuries after the wood was cut. It was a forgery, yet the image persists. Why? Because it speaks to a deep primal fear. The fear of being trapped, of being enclosed in a dark space where the walls themselves are enemies. It is the nightmare of the womb turned into a tomb. We want it to be true because it fits our narrative of the dark ages. It allows us to look at the past and shudder, feeling safe in our modern light. But if the Iron Maiden was a fiction, the next chapter of our story is a reality so grand and so tragic that it needs no embellishment. We leave the museum of fakes and step back into the hard cold light of history to the dawn of the 14th century. We are moving from the torture of the common criminal to the torture of the most powerful men in Christendom. This is a story where greed, not justice, turned the rack. It is the story of how a king decided to destroy an army of holy warriors, not on the battlefield, but in the dungeon. The year is 1307. The day is Friday the 13th, and the victims are the Knights Templar. The fall of the Knights Templar. The narrative shifts now from the hypothetical darkness of the Iron Maiden to the very real, shivering grey mist of a Paris dawn. It is Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that has echoed down the corridors of time, birthing a superstition that still makes us glance nervously at the calendar. But on this specific morning, the horror was not superstitious, it was administrative. Across France, in a synchronized strike that would impress modern military strategists, royal seneschals opened sealed orders from King Philip IV, known as the Fair. The orders were breathless and urgent. They spoke of a bitter thing, a deplorable thing, a cancer growing in the heart of the kingdom. At the exact same moment, thousands of doors were kicked open. Men were dragged from their beds, not in the Holy Land, where they were used to fighting, but in the safety of their own commanderies in Europe. These were not common criminals. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar. To understand the shock of this moment, imagine the Navy SEALs or a beloved international humanitarian organisation suddenly being arrested en masse and accused of devil worship. The Templars were the elite. They were the heroes of the Crusades, the bankers of Europe, the guardians of the Pilgrim Roads. They were wealthy, exempt from taxes, and answered only to the Pope. And that was the problem. King Philip was not a monster in the chaotic sense. He was a monster of cold, bureaucratic necessity. He was broke. He had waged costly wars against England and Flanders, and he owed the Templars a fortune. Destroying them was not just a religious act, it was a foreclosure strategy. But you cannot simply arrest the Pope's private army because you don't want to pay your debts. You need a reason. You need a crime so heinous that it overrides their immunity. You need heresy. And so, the torture chambers of Paris were prepared for a new kind of guest. These were men trained to die for God, men who had faced Saracen arrows and desert thirst. You would think they would be immune to the Inquisitor's tools. But Philip knew their weakness. They were soldiers, yes, but many were old. The fighting days of the order were largely over. The commanderies in France were filled with administrators, elderly veterans, and young recruits. They were prepared for martyrdom on the battlefield, not the slow, humiliating deconstruction of their bodies in a damp cellar. The accusations were bizarre, designed to be so shocking that they bypassed rational scrutiny. The king's lawyers claimed that during their initiation rites the Templars denied Christ, spat on the cross, engaged in unnatural acts with one another, and worshipped a bearded severed head they called Baphomet. Historians still argue about the origin of this name. Some say it was a corruption of Mahomet, others a garbled reference to Sophia or wisdom. But in the torture chamber, nuance is the first casualty. The goal was to force the knights to repeat the script Philip's lawyers had written. The torture applied to the Templars was particularly vicious because the stakes were so high. If the knights held firm, the king would look like a tyrant. He needed them to condemn themselves. In Paris, 138 Templars were interrogated under the pressure of the rack, the strappado, and the burning of feet, specifically coated in fat to increase the heat. 134 of them confessed. That is a success rate of nearly 97%. It wasn't truth. It was compliance. One night, Aimeri de Villiers-le-Duc later shouted to the papal commissioners, "I would have confessed that I killed God if they had asked me." He described how he had been tortured by fire until the flesh of his heels dropped off, leaving the bone exposed. He was a warrior reduced to a weeping broken man, agreeing to the most absurd obscenities just to make the fire stop. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical. These men had dedicated their lives to Christ. To be forced, under agony, to say they had spat on his cross was a spiritual violation that shattered their minds. They were being told that their entire order, their brotherhood, was a lie. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, an old man in his 60s, initially confessed. It was a moment of profound weakness that would haunt him. He admitted to the charges, likely hoping to save his men from further torment, thinking perhaps the Pope would intervene and understand the duress. But the Pope, Clement V, was a weak man, essentially a hostage of the French king. While the Chinon parchment, a document discovered in the Vatican archives only recently in 2001, reveals that the Pope actually secretly absolved the Templars of heresy. Publicly, he dissolved the order to appease Philip. The political machine was too strong. The Templars were doomed. The tragedy culminated 7 years later, in 1314. Jacques de Molay and another senior commander, Geoffroy de Charnay, were brought out on a scaffold in front of Notre Dame to publicly repeat their confessions and accept a sentence of perpetual imprisonment. It was supposed to be the final act of the propaganda play, but as the cardinal read the list of their crimes, something sparked in the old Grand Master. The years of silence, the shame of his earlier weakness, fell away. He interrupted the reading. He shouted to the crowd that he was guilty of only one thing, that I have lied. I have admitted to false charges to save my own life. The order is innocent. Its purity and saintliness are beyond question. The crowd was stunned. The king was furious. That very evening, without a trial, Philip ordered them to be burned on a small island in the Seine, the Ile des Juifs. As the flames rose, consuming the last leader of the Crusades, legend says de Molay shouted a curse. He called upon Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before the tribunal of God within a year. It is a chilling historical footnote that both men died within the year, the Pope of illness, the King of a hunting accident. The fall of the Templars taught the rulers of Europe a dark lesson. Torture could do more than solve crimes. It could rewrite reality. It could turn heroes into sodomites, saints into devil worshippers. It proved that if you applied enough pain, you could destroy not just a person, but an institution, a legacy, and a history. The truth of the Templars' guilt became the official record, cited for centuries, all because the body could not withstand the iron. But as the ashes of the Grand Master floated down the Seine, the machinery of the Inquisition did not stop. It had tasted blood. It had learned how to manufacture a conspiracy. And soon it would turn this weapon away from wealthy knights and toward a far more vulnerable target. The lawyers and theologians began to whisper about a new threat, not a military order, but a domestic enemy. A hidden army of wives, widows, and healers who were allegedly in league with Satan. The specific toolkit of pain developed to break the Templars was about to be unleashed on the women of Europe. The era of the witch trials was approaching, and with it, a hysteria that would turn every village into a potential courtroom and every neighbour into a potential spy. The witch, the fear, and the lie. The calendar turns again, leafing through the decades until we reach the twilight of the 15th century. The air in Europe is changing. The Renaissance is beginning to bloom in Italy, bringing art, philosophy, and light. But in the shadow of this enlightenment, a new darkness is coalescing, printed in ink and bound in leather. In 1486, a German inquisitor named Heinrich Kramer publishes a book that will sit on the desk of every judge and magistrate for the next 200 years. It is the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. Before this moment, the church had largely dismissed witchcraft as a peasant superstition, a delusion of the weak-minded. But Kramer's book argues something new and terrifying, that witches are real, that they are organised, and, crucially, that they are almost exclusively women. He weaves a toxic tapestry of misogyny and theology, claiming that women are more susceptible to the devil because they are imperfect animals with insatiable carnal lust. This book provides the legal and spiritual blueprint for a hysteria that will consume the continent. It turns the torture chamber into a factory of fantasy. We find ourselves in a small village in Germany, or perhaps Scotland, or France. The victim is no longer a wealthy knight or a defiant heretic. She is a midwife, an elderly widow, or perhaps a young woman who spurned the wrong suitor. The accusation is often petty. A cow died, milk went sour, a child fell ill. But once the machinery of the Malleus is engaged, the pettiness vanishes. Replaced by a cosmic battle between good and evil, the interrogation of a witch is unique because the crime is impossible to prove with physical evidence. You cannot find a receipt for a sold soul, therefore the body itself becomes the crime scene, a map of hidden guilt waiting to be read by the sharp tools of the torturer. The process often begins with the search for the stigmata diaboli, the devil's mark. The theory is that when the devil makes a pact with a witch, he leaves a mark, a claw print, a spot where he licked her, a teat to suckle his familiars. This mark is said to be insensitive to pain and unable to bleed. To find it, the executioner, or a professional pricker, strips the woman naked in front of the court, a devastating act of humiliation in a modest society. He then systematically pierces every mole, scar, and birthmark on her body with a long, retractable needle or a bodkin. It is a slow geometric exploration of the skin. If she screams, she is normal. If she stays silent, perhaps from shock, or perhaps because he struck a callus or a patch of nerve-damaged skin, she is guilty. The needle has found the spot where the devil touched her. The logic is impenetrable. But the most effective tool in the witch hunter's arsenal is not the rack or the screw, it is time, specifically the denial of sleep. This is known as tormentum insomniae. The accused is forced to stay awake for days, sometimes weeks. She is made to walk back and forth in her cell, watched by guards who prod her the moment her eyelids droop. We know today that prolonged sleep deprivation induces a state of psychosis. The boundaries between reality and dream dissolve. The mind, desperate for rest, begins to hallucinate. Shadows become demons. The flickering candle becomes the fires of a Sabbath. When the inquisitor finally asks, "Did you fly to the mountain? Did you dance with the goat?" the exhausted, delirious woman might genuinely believe she did. Or, more likely, she simply realizes that yes is the password to sleep. It is here that the specific narrative of witchcraft is manufactured. Historians have long noted the eerie similarities in witch confessions across Europe. Women in Italy, Germany and England all described the same flying ointments, the same dark banquets, the same chilly intercourse with Satan. For a long time, scholars debated whether this proved the existence of a real underground pagan cult, the Margaret Murray thesis. But modern history offers a grimmer explanation. The consistency came from the questions, not the answers. The inquisitors were reading from the same manual. They asked leading questions. Who was there with you? Did you kiss the devil's backside? The torture continued until the victim repeated the story the inquisitor already had in his head. Pain did not reveal the truth. It projected the inquisitor's fantasies onto the victim's voice. Consider the tragedy of the naming of names. The torture of a witch was rarely satisfied with a single confession. The witch was part of a conspiracy. She must have accomplices. Under the agony of the strappado, or the crushing of the shins in the Spanish boot, the victim would name anyone, neighbours, rivals, even her own children. This is how the trials cascaded, wiping out entire female populations in some villages. In the town of Würzburg, the hysteria reached such a fever pitch that the executioner burned 19 priests, several children, and even his own wife. The machine, once started, ate everything in its path. Yet amidst this horror, there were moments of dark absurdity. The ordeal of cold water, which we visited earlier, made a comeback during the witch trials as swimming the witch. The old logic returned. Water, being pure, would reject the witch. If she floated, she was guilty. But now, it was often done with a rope tied to the waist, and the floating could be subjective. If her petticoats trapped air and held her up for a moment before soaking through, the mob screamed, "Witch!" It was a public spectacle, a way for the community to purge its collective fear by focusing it on one scapegoat. The gendered nature of this torture cannot be overstated. While men were accused, especially in places like Iceland or Estonia, the vast majority of victims in the main European centres were women. The torture devices were often sexualised or focused on the female body's capacity for shame. The breast ripper, a cold pincer designed to tear soft tissue, is often cited in museums, though its actual judicial use is debated. Often, the threat of it or the use of hot pincers was enough. The Malleus had successfully framed the female body as a vessel of danger, a gateway for the devil that had to be forcibly closed. There is a scholarly debate note here regarding the role of ergotism, poisoning from mouldy rye bread, in sparking some of these outbursts. Some historians argue that entire villages were hallucinating from bad grain, leading to the convulsions and visions that triggered the trials. Others argue this is too convenient, ignoring the deep-seated social and misogynistic roots of the violence. The mouldy bread theory acts as a way to pathologize the event, perhaps absolving the human cruelty that drove it. The truth is likely that no chemical hallucinogen was needed when fear and religious fervour were potent enough on their own. As the 17th century wears on, the fires begin to burn lower, but the scars on the European psyche remain. The witch trials taught the world that if you torture a person enough, they will admit to impossible things. They will admit to defying the laws of physics. They will admit to flying. The torture chamber had become a theatre where the state could prove the existence of the supernatural by destroying the natural. But where did these confessions take place? We have spoken of the tools and the trials, but we have not yet looked at the space itself. The environment of the dungeon was a weapon in its own right, a weapon of architecture, darkness and stone. As the witch's scream fades into the past, we descend deeper into the bowels of the castle to examine the walls that held the silence. Stone walls and the little ease. The torture chamber was not always a place of active violence. Sometimes the room itself was the weapon. We tend to focus on the sharp iron and the stretching ropes, but for thousands of prisoners, the true agony was not what was done to them, but where they were kept. We must now look at the architecture of suffering, the way stone and mortar were arranged to break the human spirit through the slow, crushing pressure of environment. The dungeon was not merely a holding pen. It was a machine of sensory deprivation and physical distortion designed to dissolve the will long before the executioner arrived. Imagine, if you can, the silence of the oubliette. The word comes from the French oublier, to forget. It is a terrifying concept, crystallized in architecture, a bottle-shaped pit dug deep into the foundations of a castle. The only entrance is a trapdoor in the ceiling, high above. There are no stairs, no doors, no windows. The prisoner is lowered down on a rope, or simply pushed. When the trapdoor slams shut, the darkness is absolute. It is a darkness that has weight, pressing against the eyes. The air becomes stale, recycled, heavy, with the scent of damp earth and the waste of previous occupants. In this pit, you are not just imprisoned, you are erased, you are forgotten by the world above. Historians and archaeologists have engaged in a fascinating debate about these spaces. Many pits, identified as oubliettes by dramatic Victorian tour guides, were, in mundane reality, likely storage cellars for grain or ice, or perhaps latrines. The Victorians, with their flair for the Gothic, loved to imagine a skeleton in every basement. However, true oubliettes did exist, particularly in fortifications like the Bastille or the castles of the Crusader Knights. The psychological terror of the oubliette was singular. It removed the prisoner from time. In the total dark, the circadian rhythm collapses. You do not know if you have been there for hours or days. You exist in a void, fed only when a scrap of bread is dropped from the ceiling like a treat for a dog. It is the ultimate expression of powerlessness, to be buried alive while still breathing. But if the oubliette was the torture of emptiness, the little ease was the torture of confinement. This was a cell designed with diabolical mathematical precision. It was constructed to be too small for a human being to stand up in, yet too short for them to lie down. Picture a box of stone, perhaps 4 feet high and 2 feet wide. You are forced into a crouch. You try to sit, but your knees hit the wall. You try to curl up, but your back hits the other side. There is no position of rest. Every muscle in the body must remain engaged, fighting gravity, fighting the stone. Within hours, cramps set in. Within days, the pain becomes a screaming, burning agony as the muscles begin to spasm and fail. The most famous Little Ease was located in the Tower of London. It was a dark, unventilated cupboard where prisoners were often held before interrogation. It was here, allegedly, that Guy Fawkes was kept after the failure of the gunpowder plot in 1605. When we look at his shaky, shattered signature on his confession, we often attribute it to the rack. But the days spent in the Little Ease, unable to sleep, unable to stretch, his body turning into a knot of pain, likely did as much to break him as the ropes. The device weaponized the prisoner's own body weight. It turned the simple act of existing into a burden. It was a passive torture, requiring no executioner to turn a handle. The walls did the work. Then there was the condition of the air and the floor. In the bishops' prisons, or the deep dungeons of the Inquisition, sanitation was non-existent. We read accounts of prisoners standing in slurry up to their ankles, a vile mixture of mud, rising groundwater, and human excrement. This was not just disgusting, it was deadly. It bred jail fever or typhus, a louse-borne disease that killed far more prisoners than the hangman ever did. The rats were constant companions. They were bold, hungry, and numerous. There are grim legends, perhaps embellished, but rooted in fear of prisoners fighting off rats to protect their meagre rations, or worse, to protect their own sleeping bodies. The psychological toll of living in filth, of feeling the skittering of claws in the dark, stripped away the last layers of human dignity. It reduced a man to an animal fighting for survival in a burrow. We must also consider the role of temperature. In the dungeons of castles like Chillon in Switzerland, built on the edge of a lake, the cold was a physical assault. The dampness seeped into the bones, causing rheumatism and respiratory failure. Conversely, in the leads of the Doge's Palace in Venice, located directly under the lead roof, the cells became ovens in the summer, roasting the prisoners alive in the heat. The environment was carefully chosen to make the body suffer. Yet, in this architecture of despair, there is a surprising historical truth. The rich often brought their own comfort. The experience of imprisonment was vastly different depending on your wallet. A wealthy nobleman accused of treason could pay for a privileged cell. He could hire servants to bring him wine, good food, warm blankets, and even books. He could pay the jailer to leave the door unlocked for a stroll in the courtyard. The stone walls were the same, but the experience was one of inconvenient lodging rather than torture. It was the poor, the penniless heretic, the vagrant, the peasant, who suffered the full crushing weight of the dungeon's design. One of the most psychologically interesting aspects of this confinement was the graffiti. If you visit the Tower of London or the dungeons of Chinon today, you can see the intricate carvings left by prisoners. Coats of arms, prayers, poems, names, scratched into the stone with a nail or a spoon. This was not just vandalism, it was an act of defiance. It was a way to assert existence in a place designed to erase it. "I was here," the stone says. "I mattered." Some of these carvings are incredibly complex, taking months or years to complete. They represent the only thing the prisoner had left: time. The act of carving was a meditation, a way to focus the mind and keep the madness at bay. The dungeon was a place of secrets, hidden away from the public eye. What happened there was a mystery to the town above, a source of rumour and dread. But as the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, the philosophy of punishment began to shift. The authorities realised that pain inflicted in the dark served only the investigation. It did not serve the deterrence. To truly control the population, to teach the lesson of obedience, the suffering had to be seen. It had to be brought up from the cellar and displayed in the sunlight. The theatre of justice was about to open its doors. The walls of the Little Ease would be exchanged for the open stage of the scaffold. The executioner was putting on his hood not for a private session, but for a public performance. The crowd is gathering. Can you hear them? The theatre of the public square? We leave the suffocating silence of the dungeon now and step into the blinding, chaotic light of day. The air changes instantly. It no longer smells of mould and stagnation. It smells of roasting meat, unwashed bodies, horse manure, and anticipation. We are in the town square, the beating heart of the medieval city. But today, commerce has stopped. The stalls are pushed back. The windows of the surrounding houses are crammed with faces. People have climbed onto rooftops and perched on chimneys. A low hum of excitement vibrates through the cobblestones. This is not a riot, it is a holiday. It is execution day. To understand the medieval mind, we must grapple with this uncomfortable fact. The public execution was a form of theatre. It was a morality play written in blood, designed to restore the order of the world. When a crime was committed, it was seen not just as a violation of the law, but as a direct insult to the king, and by extension to God. The criminal had broken the king's peace. Therefore, the punishment had to be a public restoration of that power. It wasn't enough for the criminal to die. He had to be seen dying. The terror had to be visible. The spectacle of the scaffold, as later historians would call it, was a ritual where the king's power was physically inscribed onto the body of the condemned for all to see. The centerpiece of this stage is the scaffold, a raised wooden platform draped in black or red cloth. It elevates the violence, ensuring that even the peasants at the back can see. And on this stage, the executioner is the lead actor. He has shed his leather apron for his ceremonial garb. He is a master of ceremonies. He knows that the crowd is critical. They are not passive observers. They are an audience that can turn ugly in an instant. If he bungles the job, if the axe slips, if the rope snaps, if the victim suffers too much or too little, the crowd might riot. They might storm the scaffold and kill him. So, he performs with a grim, practiced theatricality. The methods of public torture were designed to be slow and symbolic. In France and Germany, the most feared device was the breaking wheel. It was reserved for murderers and robbers, a punishment of terrifying brutality. The condemned was strapped to a large wooden wagon wheel, or sometimes a cross-shaped frame on the ground. The executioner wielded a heavy iron bar or a wheel rim. With precise measured blows, he would shatter the long bones of the body, the shins, the thighs, the forearms, the upper arms. The goal was not to kill, but to turn the limbs into pliable ribbons. The broken body was then threaded through the spokes of the wheel, which was hoisted onto a tall pole. The victim was left there, facing the sky, to die of shock and exposure. It was a slow public disintegration, but here, in the midst of this horror, we find a strange, hidden economy of mercy. The crowd wanted a show, but the authorities often wanted efficiency. This led to the secret practice of the retentums. This was a confidential clause added to the death warrant by the judges. It instructed the executioner to strangle the victim quietly before the fire was lit or before the first bone was broken. The executioner would stand behind the prisoner, a rope concealed in his hand. As the smoke rose, or the crowd cheered the approach of the iron bar, he would tighten the garrote. The victim would slump as dead or unconscious before the worst pain began. To the crowd, it looked like he was enduring the flames or the blows in stoic silence. They cheered the spectacle, unaware they were watching a corpse. It was a grim kindness, a secret pact between the judge and the hangman to spare the soul the agony that the law demanded. The behaviour of the crowd is perhaps the most alien aspect to our modern eyes. They did not stand in sombre silence. They ate meat pies sold by hawkers. They drank ale. They placed bets on how long the victim would last. They laughed. They shouted advice to the executioner. It was a carnival of death. Souvenirs were highly prized. People believed that the body of an executed man possessed powerful magical properties. The hand of glory, the severed hand of a hanged man, was thought to cure diseases or unlock doors. The rope used in a hanging was cut into inches and sold as a lucky charm. Even the blood was collected on handkerchiefs by epileptics who believed drinking it warm would cure their seizures. The scaffold was a place where the barrier between the living and the dead was thin, and people rushed to touch the magic. Historians debate how effective this theatre of fear actually was. Did seeing a man broken on the wheel really stop a pickpocket from stealing a purse in the very crowd watching the execution? The evidence suggests probably not. In fact, pickpockets often worked the execution crowds taking advantage of the distraction. The violence became normalised. It became background noise. The state had to keep escalating the cruelty, from hanging to drawing and quartering to burning, just to keep the audience's attention. It was an inflation of pain that eventually collapsed under its own weight. In England, the punishment for treason, hanging, drawing and quartering, was the apex of this theatre. It was a multi-act play, the dragging through the streets, drawing, the hanging until half dead, the disemboweling while alive, and the final quartering of the body. The head was boiled in cumin and salt to preserve it, then stuck on a pike on London Bridge. It was a message to every traveller entering the city. This is what happens to those who challenge the king. But even this became a mundane sight. The citizens of London walked under the rotting heads every day on their way to work, barely looking up. The birds nested in the skulls. The horror had become furniture. There were moments, however, when the script failed. If a victim was young, beautiful, or repentant, the crowd's mood could shift. They might weep, they might pray aloud. In some rare cases, if the rope broke, a sign of divine providence, the crowd would surge forward to protect the condemned, arguing that God had spared them. The executioner, sensing the shift, would back away. The public square was a volatile place, where the emotion of the mob was the final judge. As the sun sets on the square, the crowds disperse, leaving the broken body on the wheel or the gibbet as a feast for the crows. The show is over. The silence returns, but it is different from the silence of the dungeon. It is the silence of a lesson delivered, however brutally. But what of the mind of the person who confessed to get here? We have talked about the physical breaking of the body, but we have not fully explored the breaking of the mind. The most tragic victims of this era were not the defiant heretics, but the ordinary people who were manipulated into believing their own guilt. We must now turn inward to the psychology of the confession to understand how a person can be convinced to destroy themselves with their own words. The fragile mind under duress. The crowds have gone home. The executioner has washed the blood from his hands, and the square is empty. But our story retreats once more into the shadows, this time not to the physical dungeon, but to a far more claustrophobic space, the interior of the human mind under siege. We have spoken at length about the breaking of bones, but the most profound and tragic destruction occurred in the psyche. We must now explore the terrifying psychology of the false confession, the moment when the mind, pushed beyond the brink of endurance, decides that death is preferable to one more minute of uncertainty. This is the internal landscape of torture, a place where reality dissolves, and the only truth that matters is the one the inquisitor wants to hear. Modern forensic psychologists classify false confessions into two grim categories: coerced compliant and coerced internalized. The medieval dungeon was a factory for both. Imagine you were sitting in the dark, shivering, your body throbbing from the strappado. The door opens. It is not the executioner this time, but the inquisitor. He brings a cup of wine. He speaks softly. He is no longer the enemy. He is the only person in the world who can save you. He tells you he wants to help. He tells you that your pain breaks his heart. Just admit it, he whispers. Just say the words, and you can sleep. You can have a blanket. You can have peace. This is the psychological trap. The prisoner, isolated and traumatized, begins to view the inquisitor not as a tormentor, but as a father figure, a twisted precursor to what we now call Stockholm Syndrome. The victim becomes desperate to please this authority figure, to anticipate his desires. They start to scan the inquisitor's face for cues. A frown means they are telling the wrong story. A nod means they are getting warmer. The confession becomes a collaborative fiction. The prisoner isn't remembering a crime. They are writing a script, line by line, based on the subtle prompts of the man across the table. But the horror goes deeper in the coerced, internalized scenario. The victim actually begins to believe the lie. This is particularly common in the witch trials, where the accusations were often dreamlike and surreal. After days of sleep deprivation, the torment of insomnia, the boundary between nightmare and wakefulness vanishes. If the inquisitor asks, "Did you see the black cat enter your room?" and you have been hallucinating formless shadows for 3 days, you might genuinely think, "Yes, perhaps I did." The mind, desperate for a logical explanation for its suffering, creates a false memory. I am suffering, therefore I must be guilty. God would not let an innocent person suffer this much. I must have done it. I must have signed the book. It is a catastrophic collapse of self. The victim rewrites their own history to make sense of their present agony. They go to the stake not screaming innocence, but weeping in repentance for crimes they never committed. This is the ultimate victory of the system. It didn't just kill the body, it colonized the soul. Historians have analyzed the transcripts of these interrogations, many of which were recorded verbatim, and found chilling patterns. The learning curve of the accused is visible in the ink. In the first session, the answers are confused, denials are frantic. By the third session, the answers are structured, theological, and precise. The peasant woman is suddenly speaking with the vocabulary of a university-trained demonologist. She isn't recounting her life. She is reciting the inquisitor's textbook back to him. There is a heartbreaking case of a young girl in Bamberg who, after weeks of pressure, asked her executioner, "Please tell me what I need to confess so I can die." She wasn't asking for mercy. She was asking for the line readings. She wanted the script so she could exit the stage. This psychological dismantling was aided by the physical environment we visited earlier. The darkness, the hunger, the cold, all of it induced a state of dependency and debilitation. The prisoner was reduced to an infantile state, entirely reliant on the captor for basic needs. In this state, the will to resist evaporates. The truth becomes a luxury the body can no longer afford. The only thing that matters is the immediate cessation of stimulus. The logic becomes brutal. If I say I am a witch, they will burn me, and the pain will end in 10 minutes. If I say I am innocent, they will rack me again, and the pain will last for hours. It is a rational calculation made by a mind in extremis, suicide by confession. There is a scholarly debate note here regarding the role of leading questions versus free narrative. In Roman law, the accused was supposed to provide a free narrative, but in practice, the inquisitors often used a technique called suggestio. They would ask, "Was the devil wearing green or red?" presuming the devil was there. To a confused mind, this is a binary choice, not a question of fact. If you answer green, you have confessed. If you answer red, you have confessed. There is no option for "he wasn't there." The language of the court was a trap with no exit. The very structure of the grammar assumed guilt. We also see the tragedy of the domino effect. Once a person broke, the inquisitor would demand accomplices. The psychological burden of this was immense. To save oneself from further pain, one had to condemn a neighbour, a friend, a spouse. The guilt of this betrayal often fractured the mind further. We read of victims who, in a delirium of shame, named everyone they knew, or conversely, named the local nobility, hoping that accusing powerful people would stop the trial. It rarely worked. The machine just expanded to swallow them too. This era teaches us a grim lesson about the fragility of memory and identity. We like to think we would be brave. We like to think we would stand up for the truth like a movie hero. But the history of medieval torture suggests otherwise. It suggests that every human being has a breaking point, and that point is often reached not through physical pain alone, but through the terrifying realization that no one is coming to help, that the world has turned against you, and that the only way out is through the door marked guilty. As the 16th and 17th centuries progressed, however, the cracks in this wall of silence began to show. The sheer volume of confessions, the absurdity of the claims, armies of witches flying on broomsticks, mass orgies with demons, began to strain credulity. If there were truly this many witches, why hadn't society collapsed? Why was the harvest still coming in? Slowly, very slowly, a few brave men within the system began to look at the shivering, broken figures in the dungeon and see not monsters, but victims. They began to realize that the torture was not revealing the truth, it was creating it. One voice, in particular, would rise from the darkness of the Jesuit order to challenge the very foundation of the logic of pain. He would risk his life to say what no one else dared, that the emperor had no clothes, and the witch had no broom. Whispers of dissent and pity. The screams of the condemned have echoed for centuries now, creating a wall of noise so thick it seems impenetrable. But if you listen closely to the history of the early 17th century, you can hear a different sound, a quiet scratching sound. It is the sound of a quill moving furiously across parchment in the dead of night. We find ourselves in a small, austere cell in a Jesuit college in Germany. The year is 1631. The 30 Years' War is raging outside, tearing Europe apart, but the man at the desk is fighting a different kind of war. His name is Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld. He is a priest, a confessor, and a poet, and he is about to commit an act of intellectual treason that will begin to crumble the foundations of the torture chamber. Friedrich Spee was not an outsider. He was part of the system. His job was to offer spiritual comfort to the women accused of witchcraft in the city of Würzburg, to walk them to the stake, and to hear their final confessions. He looked into the eyes of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of women in their final moments, moments when they had no reason left to lie. And what he saw there terrified him. He did not see the hardened malice of the devil's servants. He saw confusion, piety, and terror. He saw grandmothers who still prayed to the Virgin Mary while the wood was being piled at their feet. He realized, with a sinking heart, that he was ushering innocent martyrs to their deaths. Legend tells us that Spee's hair turned white at the age of 30. When asked why, he replied, "It is because of the witches I have accompanied to the stake." He could no longer stay silent. But to speak out was to risk being accused himself. A defender of witches was often seen as a lover of witches. So, he wrote anonymously. His book, Cautio Criminalis, Precautions for Prosecutors, was smuggled out to a Protestant city to be printed. It was a bombshell. Spee did not argue that witches didn't exist. That would have been theological suicide in 1631. Instead, he attacked the process. He dismantled the logic of torture with the precision of a surgeon. He pointed out the terrifying circularity of the system we have just witnessed. He wrote, "We torture them until they confess. If they do not confess, we say the devil has hardened them, and we torture them more. If they do confess, we burn them. There is no exit." He famously challenged the judges of Germany, "Torture the Pope, and he will confess to being a sorcerer. Torture me, and I will confess to killing God." He exposed the open secret that the truth found in the dungeon was merely the reflection of the torturer's own questions. Spee was not alone, though he was certainly the loudest. Across the Pyrenees, in the much-feared land of the Spanish Inquisition, another quiet revolution was taking place, one of bureaucracy and skepticism. We often think of the Spanish Inquisition as the most brutal of them all, and indeed, regarding heresy and Judaism, they were ruthless. But when it came to witchcraft, they were surprisingly modern. This was largely due to one man, Alonso de Salazar Frias. In 1610, following a panic in the Basque country where thousands were accused, Salazar was sent to investigate. He did something radical. He didn't just look for confessions, he looked for evidence. Salazar interviewed over 1,800 people. He took bottles of mysterious powders that witches claimed to use and fed them to animals. Nothing happened. He took flying ointments and had chemists analyze them. They were just fat and herbs. He checked the records. When a woman claimed she had been at a Sabbath all night, he found witnesses who swore she had been asleep in her bed. He returned to the Supreme Council of the Inquisition with a report that was centuries ahead of its time. There were neither witches nor bewitched, he wrote, until they were talked and written about. He argued that the witch craze was a contagion of words, spread by the very trials meant to stop it. Because of his work, the Spanish Inquisition effectively stopped burning witches more than a century before the rest of Europe. They didn't stop because they were kind. They stopped because they were lawyers who demanded full proof that actually made sense. This growing skepticism began to seep into the legal universities. The concept of spectral evidence, the idea that testimony about dreams or visions could be used in court, began to be ridiculed. The intellectual ground was shifting. The rise of the scientific revolution was bringing a new god to the table: empiricism. If you couldn't measure it, weigh it, or replicate it, it was becoming harder to use it to kill a man. The hidden truth of the soul was being replaced by the observable truth of the world. But old habits die hard. The torture chambers did not close overnight. In fact, in some places they worked overtime, as if sensing their days were numbered. But the moral certainty was gone. The judges began to hesitate. The executioners began to complain about their pay. The silence of the dungeon was being broken by the chatter of the coffee houses, where philosophers were beginning to talk about human rights and dignity. The transition from the medieval to the modern was not a sharp line. It was a slow, agonizing fade. It was a period where the rack sat gathering dust in one room, while a scientist performed an autopsy in the next. The two worlds overlapped, the world of pain and the world of reason. But the momentum was irreversible. The arguments of Spee and Salazar were like water dripping on a stone. Eventually, they cracked the monolith. As we approach the final chapter of our journey, the torches are flickering out. The heavy iron doors are being unbarred. A new light is coming from the age of enlightenment. Men like Voltaire and Beccaria are about to pick up their pens and declare that torture is not just unreliable, it is a crime against humanity itself. The era of pain as proof is ending. The era of correction is beginning. But as we walk out of the darkness, we must ask ourselves, did the impulse to torture truly vanish, or did it just change its name? The dawn of reason and mercy. The candle that has lit our path through the centuries is burning low. casting long, soft shadows against the walls of history. We have walked through the fire of the ordeal, swum in the cold rivers of judgment, and stood trembling before the rack. But as we step into the mid-18th century, the heavy wooden doors of the medieval world begin to creak open, letting in a blinding, cleansing light. We have arrived at the Enlightenment. The air here is crisp, smelling not of incense and blood, but of ink, coffee, and revolution. This is the era where the human mind decided to stand up and look the system of pain in the eye, and for the first time, blink. The dismantling of the torture chamber was not achieved by a sudden wave of sentimentality. It was achieved by a book. In 1764, a shy 26-year-old Italian aristocrat named Cesare Beccaria published a slim treatise titled On Crimes and Punishments. He wrote it in secret, terrified of the backlash from the church and the state. But when it was released, it exploded across Europe like a firework. Beccaria didn't just say torture was cruel, everyone knew that. He said it was stupid. He applied the cold, hard logic of mathematics to the law. He argued that torture was a sure method for acquitting robust criminals and condemning weak innocents. If a guilty man had a high pain tolerance, he would walk free. If an innocent man had sensitive nerves, he would confess to anything. Therefore, torture was not a test of truth. It was a test of muscle and sinew. It was a variable that ruined the equation of justice. Beccaria's words found their way into the hands of the most powerful people on earth. In France, the fiery philosopher Voltaire took up the cause, galvanized by the tragic Calas affair. Jean Calas, an innocent Protestant merchant, had been broken on the wheel for the alleged murder of his son, a murder that was actually a suicide. Voltaire used his celebrity to turn Calas into a symbol of everything wrong with the old world. He shamed the judges, he shamed the king, he argued that a civilized society could not claim to be just while it ripped people apart on suspicion. The intellectual tide turned. To support torture was no longer seen as being tough on crime. It was seen as being backward, a relic of a superstitious past that smelled of the Dark Ages. Monarchs who wanted to be seen as enlightened despots began to race each other to abolish it. Frederick the Great of Prussia was among the first, banning torture effectively in 1740, though he kept it quiet to avoid looking soft. Catherine the Great of Russia followed suit. The torture chambers were not stormed by angry mobs. They were closed by bureaucratic decrees. The racks were chopped up for firewood. The strappado ropes were cut down. The Iron Maiden, if she ever truly existed, was relegated to the curiosity shop. The questioning was over. The law had decided that the body was inviolable, that a person's guilt must be proven by external facts, by fingerprints, by documents, by logic, not by the internal breaking of the will. But there is a scholarly debate note that casts a long shadow over this victory. Historians argue whether torture disappeared because we became better people, or simply because the state found more effective ways to control us. As the scaffold faded, the penitentiary rose. The prison was no longer just a holding pen. It became the punishment itself. The concept of doing time was born. Reformers believed that instead of breaking the body, they should mould the soul. They built massive silent prisons like the Panopticon, designed to watch the prisoner at every moment. The scream was replaced by the silence of solitary confinement. Michel Foucault, the famous philosopher, argued that this was not necessarily gentler, just more efficient. The state moved its grip from the ankle to the mind. We stopped torturing the flesh and started managing the life. And yet, we must not be too cynical. The abolition of judicial torture was a monumental leap for humanity. It established the radical idea that a prisoner is still a human being, entitled to dignity even in the face of accusation. It drew a line in the sand that said, there are things the state cannot do. It was the birth of human rights. The sadism that had been legal for 2,000 years was pushed into the shadows, labelled a crime, a deviation, a horror. However, the echo of the dungeon never truly vanished. It lingered in the third degree of police stations, in the secret black sites of modern wars, in the dark corners where fear still outweighs the law. The temptation to use pain to find the ticking bomb remains a ghost that haunts the modern world. But the difference, the crucial difference, is that it is no longer the law. It is no longer performed in the town square with the blessing of the priest. It is hidden, shameful, and illegal. The light of the Enlightenment did not banish the darkness entirely, but it forced it to hide. As we stand at the end of this long, harrowing journey, looking back at the smoking ruins of the past, we see a landscape scarred by suffering, but also marked by resilience. We see the thousands of nameless victims who endured the unendurable. We see the brave souls who finally said enough. We see the evolution of justice from a magical test of fire to a rational test of evidence. We realize that the story of torture is not just a story of cruelty. It is a story of our desperate, clumsy, and often violent search for truth. It is a reminder that truth is fragile. It cannot be forced. It cannot be squeezed out of a dying body. It must be found with patience, with compassion, and with the humble admission that we might be wrong. The instruments are silent now. The museums hold the rusty shackles behind glass, safe and cold. The ghosts of the rack and the wheel have faded into the mists of history. The heavy book of medieval law is closed. The ink is dry. The candle flickers one last time, dancing against the dark, and then, with a wisp of smoke, it goes out. You are back in the safety of your own time, in the warmth of your own bed. The nightmare is over. The dawn has come. And now, let the weight of the centuries slide off your shoulders. We have travelled a long, hard road tonight, walking through the shadows of the past. But those shadows cannot touch you here. You are safe. You are warm. The stone walls have dissolved into the comfort of your room. The iron chains have turned to soft blankets. The history we have explored is a heavy tale, but it is also a finished one. The voices of the past have had their say, and now they are resting. The silence that surrounds you now is not the silence of the dungeon, but the peaceful, healing silence of the night. It is a silence that belongs to you. Let your breathing slow down, deep, steady, and calm. With every breath, you are stepping further away from the ancient fear and closer to deep, restorative sleep. The logic of pain has been replaced by the logic of rest. The world is quiet. The story is done. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to prove. Just the gentle drift into the velvet dark. Sleep now. The past is a dream, and the morning will bring a new bright day. Sweet dreams.